Okay, folks, so we are live. So for those listening at home, welcome to the Dungeon Musings YouTube channel. My name is Kevin Madison, and I'll be your friendly guide to the world of Pathfinder for Savage Worlds and the Iron Gods. Because you see, tonight I'm going to what I want to shoot is a quick overview of what Pathfinder for Savage Worlds is. And I also want to provide a quick introduction to the world of Iron Gods, and then conclude with a discussion of how I'm using those in our current campaigns at the time of recording, our current campaigns leading up to our annual gaming marathon for 2021, which will be making use of these games. The reason I wanted to make these this video is because regular viewers of the channel will be familiar with a lot of the other games that we play here. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, D&D 4th we play at the odd time, Conan, 2D20, Champions. But one of the games that is, I imagine, is for one, less familiar for people on the channel is Pinnacle Entertainment's very, very cool Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, which we've been playing a fair bit of on our Sundays. But in particular, this game, the combination of Savage Worlds and Pathfinder that we've been playing lately. The reason, I guess, I wanted to provide this introduction is, for one, the game's actually not out yet. The Kickstarter, at the time of recording, the Kickstarter was successful and enormously successful, and Pinnacle has released a draft version of this. This is at the time of recording, this is the third draft of the Pathfinder for Savage Worlds. Going forward in this video, I'm going to refer to this as Savage Pathfinder because it's just easier. But their version of Savage Pathfinder, this is the third version of it out so far. It's still going to be up for revision between now and when the final game releases. And in addition, they're going to be adding on material in a companion that will come with this, and a bestiary that'll be full of Pathfinder-appropriate monsters. So effectively what this is an effort to combine, or not to combine, I shouldn't say that, that's not a right way of describing it. It is to make this simulate this, Pathfinder First Edition. So the approach I'm going to take on this, because Pathfinder is such a relatively common game, or at least it's a very, very well-known game, and since the Savage Worlds is less well known, what I'm going to assume, and since I guess Pathfinder is so close to some of the concepts of Dungeons & Dragons, I'm going to assume that you have familiarity with Pathfinder, with the idea of like elves and dwarves and rogues and rangers and things like that. And I'm going to talk more specifically about what is in the Savage Pathfinder book instead. I'm also going to talk about some of the different subsystems. Like, one of the things that is very interesting about Savage Worlds in general is that it has a number of subsystems, and the subsystems are there to sort of to fill in the role, or not fill in the role, but to provide a game structure to different elements of gameplay. And those will be things like interacting with other characters. It'll be like overland travel. It'll be like trying to do an extended task, like maybe disarming a bomb, or trying to infiltrate a villain's lair or something like that. There's different chase rules as well too, and there are a number of different options for how to model those things depending on how you want to do it. One of the really great things about Savage Worlds is that it has the benefit of having had about 4 or 5 different iterations of it. So the game has gone through a number of revisions, and while the core mechanic has remained the same, the game itself has changed and learned and added new things as it goes along. And that's exactly what they've done in this as well. And this stands on the shoulders of another very successful adaptation that Pinnacle did of the classic post-apocalyptic world of Rifts, a game from Palladium. So what my intent for this is that at the end of this video, you will have at least an understanding of the core mechanic of Pathfinder, or of Savage Pathfinder. You'll have an understanding of the different subsystems that you're seeing in play in the games that we're playing on the channel, so you understand where it fits in and what's actually happening. And hopefully a side benefit will be, it'll help you decide if this is something you want to check out as well. This is not sponsored whatsoever by either Paizo or Pinnacle, the Paizo being the publisher of Pathfinder, Pinnacle being the people behind Savage Worlds and the Savage Pathfinder. And then I'm going to conclude with a little bit of an introduction. Well, I guess the other thing I want you to have at the end of this is to be able to understand what the Iron Gods sort of setting is, what we're, to expect in the adventure path, why you're seeing so many unusual races selected by the characters or played by the player characters. And then I'm going to also end with some of the things I have stolen from other Savage Worlds games to make use of in our Iron Gods game, to make it play the way it does. Because one of the nice things with Savage Worlds is it's effectively a universal system, and you can grab stuff from other Savage Worlds games and use them in your Savage Pathfinder games. So it means that you're getting a lot of mileage out of a lot of the books that you may have purchased for other reasons, or at least for an idiot like me and has too many books, it's an excuse to get use of many of those books. So that's the task here. We're going to go through what's in the current version of Savage Pathfinder. We're going to talk about how those actually play at the table. We're going to talk about the Iron Gods, and then we'll talk about how I'm customizing it. And at the end of that, I'm hoping that you will be completely ready to dive in and follow us along and know exactly what's happening on the screen and what's happening in the games. So with that, let's start with Savage Pathfinder. So again, I'm going to assume you know what Pathfinder stuff is, but not Savage Worlds. So Savage Pathfinder is, as I said, it is an effort to try and capture the flavor of Pathfinder, or other D20 based fantasy role-playing games like, say, Dungeons and Dragons. It is trying to capture that stuff within the context of the Savage Worlds rules. It is not trying to replicate the mechanics of Pathfinder. So you're not going to find Vancian magic where people are memorizing spells or things like that, or the specific number of X uses per day for different class abilities. What it is trying to capture is the feel of those classes and the essence of those classes in play in a Savage Pathfinder kind of way, so that when you play the game, it feels like you're playing a D&D monk or a Pathfinder monk or a Pathfinder wizard. I'm being a little facetious about saying haha D&D. I will say that the adaptation of specific class mechanics is focused on how they are represented in Pathfinder. Pathfinder class mechanics are different from those in 3.5, and of course different in 4th edition and 5th edition. So there are certain things like a wizard's arcane bond, for instance, or the bloodlines you're picking for your sorcerers. Those are things that were introduced in Pathfinder 1st edition, not in D&D. So or at least in D&D 3.5. So I'm being a little facetious about how this could be used for D&D as well, but it definitely takes its specific cue from 1st edition Pathfinder. The core mechanic in Savage Worlds is that you are always going to be rolling. I got some visual aids here. So you're going to roll a dice equal to, for your player characters, you're going to roll a dice that is equal to the relevant stat. Your stats and by stats I mean your attributes and your skills are measured in a specific dice size. They can be as low as D4, and if you're not trained in something, so this is more for skills than stats, if you're not trained in something, you have a D4 minus 2. So that's any skill that you have not actually spent any time training. That's what your skill score is, but they run from a D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, and then it's a D12 plus different modifiers, plus 1, plus 2, plus 3, plus 4. In addition, while you're rolling that, if your character is a wild card, which is one of the two different types of characters in the game, all player characters are wild cards. The only thing you need to know about a wild card is that a wild card will also always get to roll something called the wild die. Wild die is a D6. Maybe I shouldn't have got a reflective metal dice for this. It's a D6 that is rolled alongside whatever your stat is, whether it's your skill or your attribute, and then you choose the highest of the two. So let's say I've got a D8 in agility. I'm going to roll my D8, and I'm going to roll my D6, which is my wild die, and I take the higher of the two. Another mechanic is that there is something called acing. Acing is when you roll, basically it's exploding dice. They don't call it, everything in Savage Worlds has a very card kind of focus, and the reason for that is due to the historical background of the of Savage Worlds. Savage Worlds, it originates from a game called Deadlands, which came out in the late 80s, early 90s. That was a horror Wild West thing. doesn't really matter. The only thing you need to know is that the original game that this came from, that this mechanic came from, was a Western style, so a lot of the nomenclature in the game has that sort of carryover, where there's playing cards and chips and stuff like that. You use poker chips as something called bennies in the game, which is their narrative meta currency, or at least one of the narrative meta currencies in the game. So if you roll a maximum number on whatever dice you're rolling, that is the, let's say I rolled an 8 on my agility check, I get to pick it up, roll it again, and add it to the 8. You do that with both of your dice, your wild dice and your other dice, your stat dice, and that's how you do task resolution. Everything is always going to be make a roll of whatever your stat is plus your wild dice. The adversaries that your characters will face are one of two things. Some of them will be wild cards, but it's like the named bad guys. Everyone else is going to be what's called an extra. One of the ways that extras differ from wild cards is that they don't have a wild dice. They have to rely on just whatever the results of their dice are. One basic mechanic with the game as well is that unless you are contesting something, unless you're trying to defeat someone or hit someone or outsmart someone or whatever, then your target number is always going to be a 4. So you want to roll 4 or higher. And for every 4 higher than that, so let's say my target number was a 4, and then I rolled that thing. I rolled an 8 and then exploded to it, and I rolled a 2, or it aced. I rolled again, I got a 2. My total is 10. That is 6 above my target number. That means that I got a raise. Every 4 above whatever your target number is counts as a raise. So, and that is for every aspect of task resolution. Some elements of task resolution, it doesn't matter how many raises you get, but sometimes it does. When you're inflicting damage, every raise that you get increases the amount of damage that you do. So raises, sometimes all you need is just whether you get 1 or not, that's it. And the effect will always be better if you get a raise. And sometimes the number of raises are important, particularly with respect to damage or soaking damage. There are a couple other subsystems that do sometimes matter for that, but for the most part, that's all you need to know. Pick up your dice equal to your stat, pick up your wild dice, roll the dice, anything that aces, roll again and add it to it, pick your highest number, and then compare that to the target number. If the target number, or what you rolled, is 4 higher than whatever the target number is, you got a raise. If it's the target number you rolled up to 3 higher, you got a success. If you rolled below it, you failed. There is one other result that can come up, and that is when you roll snake eyes. When you roll double ones on any of your dice, that is a critical failure or a fumble. That means something very bad has happened. And sometimes there are prescribed things that happen, but more often it is, well, that's not true. There's more often than not, there's a prescribed result. And it's usually pretty interesting, and it changes. They're not just punishing elements. It's things that, to be honest, feel fun at the table. They don't feel like they are, well, that was unfair. The game as a whole, to understand Savage Worlds and to understand Pathfinder or Savage Pathfinder, the game is much more about capturing the cinematic feel of exciting, fiction. It is very much the byline for a long time was fast, fun, and furious. And that is very much what Savage Worlds is about. And in the same way that it does that for its own proprietary settings, and it did for Savage Rifts, the Savage Pathfinder is about those amazing moments when you're playing D&D or you're playing Pathfinder. Those really awesome, badass moments, both good and bad. And that's what one way you have control over the game, over the results of the dice, is you will start each session, your character, any wild card, that is under the control of a player, will start with 3 bennies. Now, these are just the poker chips that came with my most recent Deadlands thing, but you can use anything. You have 3 bennies, and the bennies are spent for a number of different things, but one of the things you can do is to re-roll a dice result as long as you didn't fumble. So, and over the course of play, you will get lots more bennies. When you do something funny or entertaining or great or achieve a goal or transition from a scene to another scene or whatever, you will get a benny back. And in Savage Pathfinder, every time you sleep overnight, you'll get a new benny. The reason that's important is because the bennies are one of the ways that it allows you to make your characters feel badass. But you are not the only ones who get bennies. DMs get bennies as well, or the marshals. I think they're called game masters now. They used to be called marshals, and I just got in the habit of calling it that. Bennies are spent to re-roll, and that's both the attacks or skill results or effects. You can re-roll damage in this as well. You start with 3 at default, and then you can spend them throughout, and you'll gain new ones. So it becomes this fast, and the bennies get received and spent over the course of the game. And as long as you didn't get those snake eyes, then you're going to be fine. The combat system in the game is an outgrowth of that. To take on any person's or any character's turn, what they will get a chance to do is take a movement. So you have a pace on your character, which is your how many. What is it? It's how many whatever the number is, you multiply that by 2. That's how many yards you can move in a round, and you can always just decide to run as well, unless you've selected an action that will prevent you from doing that. You roll a dice equal to your running dice, which is usually a d6. The reason that's important to know is because the movement is a totally different part of your action. You can otherwise take all of your actions. Standing up from prone is 2 points of your pace, so you hop up and you can get going. Then what you get to choose is how many actions you are going to take as well. You can take a maximum of 3 actions, unless you've got some other modifier that changes that. And for each action beyond the first one, you take -2 cumulatively. So if you decide I'm going to take, let's say I'm going to swing my sword 3 times, well then every single one of those attacks will be at -4. Because -2 for my second action, -4 for my third action, all my actions get -4 on them. There are a number of different combat options that you can select as you are, involved in combat. But your actions are generally, if you decide to attack in Savage Pathfinder, you use one of 2 skills generally, unless you're casting a spell. Those two skills will be fighting or shooting. There's not a huge breakdown of weapon proficiencies or anything like that. You're assumed to be able to use any weapon. One of the ways that there is a controlling factor in that is that a lot of weapons have a strength minimum, and you will not do a lot of damage if you're using something heavier than what you can actually wield. And in addition, the encumbrance is a thing you track in Savage Pathfinder, as you do in Pathfinder 1. And it's very easy if you are weak to find yourself over encumbered. So the attack will be either you're fighting or you're shooting, and then the melee attacks are against a target number that is set by the parry. Every target has a parry, which is their number to be hit in melee, and absent any other modifiers, that is a number equal to 2 plus half of their fighting dice. So if they have a fighting of, say, 10, then a d10, then what it would be is half of 10 is 5, plus 2 is 7. Your parry may be modified by different edges you pick. If you're familiar with feats in Pathfinder or in D&D 5th, or in 4th for that matter, the edges in this feel very much like that. They give you something that other characters cannot do. Sometimes it's a math modifier, but more often it's something else. It's some other option. Your parry can be modified by edges, and your parry can be modified by the weapons you use, and whether you're using a shield, because your shield can affect your parry score in Savage Pathfinder. If you hit, then what you're going to do is you're going to roll your damage dice, and if you happen to get a raise on your attack, then you'll also get to roll an extra d6 on your damage dice. Damage dice also ace, so they also explode. They can also get much, much bigger. So damage and, I should say combat in this, as you can tell with the number of different dice that you're rolling and the number of things that can explode, it can be very exciting and unpredictable. The dice you're rolling for damage, more often than not, is going to be at least 2 dice. Weapons like bows or bows and arrows and things like that do about 2d6 damage, unless you've got some other modifier. The weapons that you're wielding by hand, you use your strength score plus whatever the score is for the weapon, and those range from a d4 for a dagger up to a d10 for a greatsword or a maul or something like that. Another thing that fits in for damage as well is something called armor piercing, which they make great use of in Savage Pathfinder. Armor piercing reduces the target number for you to injure somebody. So I mentioned that everyone has a parry. Everyone also has a toughness score. And the toughness score starts at half of your vigor stat, half of your vigor attribute, +2. So if you have a vigor attribute that is at, say, D6, then your default toughness is 2 + 3 is 5. That is modified by spells, by armor, by feats, or by edges, I should say. So then what the attacker needs to do is roll damage that is equal to or greater than the toughness. And then again, for every 4 points over, they count an extra success. A undamaged character who is hit becomes what is put in a situation called shaken. It's sort of you're not quite injured yet. You're not suffering from an actual wound, but what you're in a position where you could really be. You've been knocked. Your defenses are down. The next hit that hits you may actually score some significant injury. The shaken state can be removed immediately by spending a Benny, or on any character's turn, they can roll their spirits, the spirit stat, to try and shake that. If they fail to shake themselves, then they can't take an action. They can take free actions, but they cannot take any other kind of action. The shaken character, I guess, if you hit an undamaged character, if you get a raise, on top of shaking the character, you also inflict a wound. If it is an extra, without any other kind of circumstances, that extra is dead. Full stop. So this is the, nameless goblins and things like that. You carve your way through them. If you are fighting a wild card, or a character or an NPC that is a wild card, or an adversary that's a wild card, then what you are able to do is the target takes up to 3 wounds before they fall, before they become incapacitated. In addition, when you are hit by or injured by someone, you take wounds, you can spend a Benny to make a vigor check and try and reduce that. It's called soaking. So for every success and raise, you get to reduce that by 1. In Savage Pathfinder, any given attack will never do more than 4 wounds. So what that means is that if you're sitting on a Benny and you can try and soak something, you can always try and get yourself out of death. It doesn't mean the dice will agree with you. It means that you have a chance of getting away from dying from one solid hit. So it is a way of mitigating against the crazy exploding dice. If someone happens to get on an attack, rolling 2d6 and the total they get is a 36, this is a way to sort of not have you rolling to soak 8 wounds or whatever the heck that would be. So the last thing I'll say about combat is then, of course, the shooting. Shooting is not quite the same. You're not targeting toughness. Instead, you're just rolling against, at default, the same target number you are when you're rolling something uncontested. It's a 4. That can be modified by range, by visibility conditions, by other things, sometimes by feats or or edges or class abilities that the characters have. But at default, range attacks are going to be against a 4. The other thing that I'll mention about combat, because this is the first mention I'll have of the way that the cards come into play, and I'm going to use a visual aid here as well. So the Savage Worlds or Savage Pathfinder makes use of at least 1, ideally 2 decks of playing cards. These are the ones that came in the most recent Adventure Edition box set, but a regular deck of playing cards is just fine. You use it with this, with the jokers in. At the start of everyone's turn, and when you're in combat, what you will do is draw a card and place it in front of the character. That is going to be when their action comes up. Once you deal all your cards, everyone can spend a Benny to try and draw a new card and take the better of the 2. Now, in this case, obviously, that's worse. Ace of Spades, you'll see in a moment why this is one of the best initiative results. You draw the cards for everyone, and for the adversaries, you do it in a group. It's either, so if there is, say, goblins the characters are fighting, but there's also a goblin commander, and the goblin commander is a wild card. The wild card will get one, and then the group will just get another one, and they'll all take their actions on that one. Once everyone has been provided their cards, and they decide spend however many bennies they want to try and get new cards and get the highest of the two, then what you do is you go from highest suit or highest highest number of the card going down. So starting with aces high, going down, and then everyone takes their action on their turn. If you have ties, so two people have jacks, say, you go in reverse alphabetical order. So spades go first, then hearts, then diamonds, then clubs. And if you happen to draw a joker, jokers are particularly awesome because when you draw a joker, first thing you do is everyone on your side gets a benny. And that includes for enemies as well, too. Everyone gets a benny. Then whoever is acting on that joker, they will get a +2 to whatever actions they take that round, and they get to go whenever they want. They can choose when they want to go in the round. The other thing is that you can choose to hold your card. If you're gonna, you can hear goblins outside the door. You know they're gonna break in, but you don't want to, or maybe it's reinforcements coming, which would be why you'd be in combat. I got my 10 of clubs, but they're not in yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm going to hold it. That means I keep this thing in my hands and I don't get a new card until I take this action or until I give it up. And then when it comes up on a time when I want to act, I have to make a contested athletics check against the target. And then if I win, I get to go before them. The Joker is better than that. Joker allows you to go whenever. When you decide when you're going to go. It's not like a held card. Once a Joker comes up, and the turn is over, and everyone's got their cards, then you reshuffle the deck, and then you go again. So there will always be 2 possible jokers coming up on any given draw. There's always a chance of that dramatic kind of event happening. So that's how combat works. That's how your turns work in combat, and how the raises function, and the successes and raises function, and the very, very core of the things you're going to, the mechanics, I should say, that will drive everything else we talk about. The reason I want to talk about that before we get into the actual book is because I think those are a good baseline to keep in your head of how fighting. To be honest, Pathfinder, the rules for Pathfinder for D&D, the most complicated stuff you see and the thing that gets the most attention is most often the combat. So if you've got those fundamentals down of using fighting against parry and using shooting against a target number 4 plus situational modifiers, you know what you're doing on your round. You know how to if you want to inflict violence on another character, you know how to do that in Savage Pathfinder. So let's talk about the actual rules here. So the mechanics. When you're making a character, this may be a good way of structuring it. When you're making a character in Savage Pathfinder, you're going to be making, it's a point generation system. You will be first assigning your 5 attributes. So your attributes all start at a D4, and you have 5 points to modify them. The stats you've got are agility. Let's see if I can remember these correctly. Agility, smarts, spirit, strength, and vigor. So that's agility, smarts, spirit, strength, vigor. I think those are probably fairly self-evident what they do, but spirit is your willpower, and it also sort of controls the stats or skills that make use of social interaction. So it's also kind of like your default charisma. In a Pathfinder sense, it's your wisdom and your charisma sort of folded together. Strength is what you use to inflict damage or to do a lot of strength-based activities. Vigor is your toughness and your hail and hardiness and dictates what your toughness is. Agility covers a lot of fighting stuff, so fighting and shooting are both covered by that, as is agility at default. And not agility, as is athletics at default. And so you start with a D4 in each of those. You will have 5 points to modify that. And then your race will also likely modify that. Even humans in Savage Pathfinder, they get a better deal than the regular humans do in Savage Worlds Adventure Edition. You get to not only get a free edge, you also get a chance to bump up one of your stats by 1. Most races will modify stats up by 1, but like Pathfinder, many of them also suffer a penalty. Savage Pathfinder also models size, so smaller races like halflings and dwarves and whatnot will be a little bit slower than what their companions are, but it's not quite as punishing as it is in Pathfinder. Dwarves don't move at half the rate that say like larger size creatures do. What happens is your pace is reduced by a little bit. Remember, you multiply that by 2 to find how many yards you move, and then it also reduces the size of your running dice. That can be modified again by edges. So there's one cool one called Fleet-Footed that gives you a bonus to your pace, and it bumps up your dice. So if you do want to play a speedy little dwarf, you can absolutely do that. In addition, once you've got your stats assigned, you also get a number of points in skills. There are what are called, I can't remember if they call them everyman skills or common skills or basic skills. But there are a number of skills that you have access to that you automatically start at a base number. Let's see here. They are called core skills in this. I believe there are 5 core skills. I could be wrong about that, but the core skills are things that it's another really clever thing that they did in older versions of Pathfinder of Savage Worlds. They used to just give you a bunch of skill points, and then you'd spend them where you want. And inevitably, if it was people who had not played Savage Worlds before, you start playing, and like basic skills like notice or persuasion would never, the characters may not have them because the players may not have thought to give them that. So in Adventure Edition, they introduced the idea of core skills where everybody has them, and they carry that over into this. So what that means is that regardless of what kind of character you're playing, although this might be modified by your race or some other factors, you will automatically have a D4 in athletics, common knowledge, notice, persuasion, and stealth. Look at that, 5 and 5. So the most of those I think are going to be self-evident. The common knowledge one is really just your understanding of the world. So if you're playing a character who, even if you're a novice, if you're someone who's never played in a Pathfinder setting before or some other Savage World setting, if you've got a common knowledge of, say, D8, that's a pretty good chance of you having a fundamental understanding of like, okay, I don't understand the context of this, of what I'm seeing here. Like, an example is in one of our recent Savage Pathfinder games, one of the characters was attacked by someone who, and it turned out it was by someone who he had selected as one of his enemies, or at least his character had as one of his enemies. And I asked the characters to make a common knowledge roll. They were successful, so they were able to put together some of the stuff that their character would know that the players may not. In which case it was like, well, so in this particular organization, this particular attacker was undercover and then chose to break that cover to try and attack this one character. The implication being that, wow, that's a pretty important resource they blew just to try and get a hold of this guy. So common knowledge is also a fun way of making use of it to if you don't know whether a character has been to a location before, you can just say, all right, let's just roll common knowledge and see. So it can be a fun way of helping to fill in backstory. But apart from those 4, so you start with those 4 or 5 skills at a D4, you then get 12 points that you can use to raise up any of your other skills. And you're not restricted by what skills you take. Some of the classes in Savage Pathfinder have requirements, so you need to have at least a certain level, usually a D6, in a certain skill, and you may need a certain stat as well, too, like a level of smarts for a wizard or a level of vigor for a warrior or a fighter. But otherwise, you're pretty much free to build the character as you please. The list of skills are they're not super long. I'll go through them just so you have an idea of what they are. Because like Pathfinder, to be honest, they've consolidated skills to make it a shorter list. Again, the game is less about having a number of fine granular detail about your characters, particular things you can and can't do, and more about like, all right, we got gross generalities. If you got a high fighting stat or fighting skill, you're going to be good at melee combat. they're not concerned really with whether you've got training in the weapons that your class has. It's kind of assumed that the strength minimums will take care of that. But here's the skills: academics, athletics, battle, which is like mass combat, boating, common knowledge, driving, faith, which is used by clerics and priests and probably oracles when they come out, fighting, gambling, healing, intimidation, language, notice, occult, which is the catch-all knowledge for like arcana, performance, persuasion, piloting, repair, riding, science, shooting, spell casting, used by arcane casters, stealth, survival, taunt, and thievery. That's all the skills. It may seem like there's a very that's not a huge list for it, but you will find that your skill points will go by very quickly. For every point that you spend on your skill points, it will allow your skill to go up by 1 dice. If you don't have a dice in that skill yet, like something that's beyond the core skills, you spend 1 point to get a D4 in it. The reason I mentioned the attributes before is because each skill is linked to a certain attribute. And up until the point where it is equal to that attribute, it costs you 1 point. Each one beyond that costs 2. So it gets expensive to keep your attributes, to get skills beyond that. I don't think skills can start higher than a D10 at the start of the game. In addition to that, so you get your 12 points for skills, you get your 5 points for your attributes, your modifiers from your race. You'll get 2 other things. One is your class edge. Now, in Savage Pathfinder, you can select a class edge or a kind of edge called professional edge, but I'm just going to focus on the class ones. Every one of the classes that is in Pathfinder 1st Edition, the Pathfinder 1st Edition core rulebook, is in Savage Pathfinder. So you have barbarians, bards, clerics, druids, paladins, fighters, monks, wizards, sorcerers. I'm forgetting one. Who am I forgetting? Is there 10 or am I not forgetting any? Forgive me. This is what happens when I try and showboat. Let's go through just the list here. All right, so we got our barbarians, bards, clerics, fighters, druids, paladins, monks, rangers, rogues. I always forgot rogue. They were clearly hiding in shadows. Sorcerers and wizards. So every one of those, you get that. The class edge will come with a couple of things. One of them is, and this is not for all of them, because ones that aren't restricted in armor, but just like in Pathfinder or Dungeons & Dragons, the class edge that it has certain armor restrictions. So rogues, for instance, have an armor restriction of nothing that is heavier than light. If they wear medium or heavy armor, they suffer a -4 penalty to all their agility and agility checks and agility-based stats or skills. And again, agility-based skills include fighting, shooting, and athletics. So all the things you use to, fisticuff or climb walls or things like that, stealth is an agility-based one. Thievery is an agility-based one. Casters have it even worse. Not only do they get a penalty to those agility things, they also get a penalty to their spell casting rolls. And as you may remember from earlier in the video, the target number is usually a 4, so a -4 to that means you need an 8 just to start with your success. So it's a big penalty. It doesn't mean it's impossible, and there are edges you can take, just like in Pathfinder. There's ways you can customize your character to mitigate against that. There's also the option in Savage Pathfinder of multi-classing, and one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the advancements of characters. Characters advance, they get experience and they get benefits, and their characters change over time, just like in other role-playing games, or most other role-playing games. Not Traveler, really. But the way that the sort of relative power level of your character is measured is in a number of tiers. Your characters start at novice tier, then they go up to seasoned, then they go to veteran, then they go to heroic, and then they end up in legendary. And the reason that's important to know is because there are certain edges that are restricted by the tier. So certain really badass edges that give you a huge benefit, they're often not available until you get to legendary. The way that you go up in that, it depends. One of the neat things, just like in Pathfinder, how you can have different tables of experience points to mitigate how fast you want to advance, you can do the exact same thing in this. And the default in Savage Worlds is that you get what's called an advancement after the end of every adventure, or session, I should say. The advancement can be spent for a number of different things, but they include getting a new edge, which is, again, like a feat, get a little packet of powerful modifiers. It can raise the stat number of one, or the dice of one of your attributes. You can only do that once per tier, though, so you've got to be careful to time that out. Or you can raise a skill that is equal to or greater than the governing attribute by 1, or you can select 2 skills that are lower than the governing attribute and raise each of those by 1. So, or to learn a new skill at a D4. Advancements in Savage Pathfinder, I guess one of the things that was kickstarted alongside the Savage Pathfinder Kickstarter was a box set for Rise of the Runelords, the first adventure path that Paizo put out for. Actually, I think it was out for 3.5 first, and then it was converted to Pathfinder afterwards. But first adventure path that Paizo put out in its own world of Golarion, that has been converted over, or is in the process of being converted over to Savage Pathfinder. That adopts the same milestone approach that a lot of the adventure paths do. So if you want to run an advancement scheme along the lines of what you do in Pathfinder, where characters complete a certain adventure, then they get certain kinds of rewards, you can do that. For myself, in our game right now, we're just awarding an advancement every session. And the reason being is because it's fun. It's really fun for players to be able to pick new abilities for their characters. And the nice thing is with Pathfinder, Savage Pathfinder, and Savage Worlds in general, is there's usually more great options to pick than there are advancements you have available. So you don't really need to worry about the characters, all falling into the same the same trope, or worried about the characters getting too powerful. It's with the way the dice work in this, it doesn't really matter if they've got a whole bunch of advancements, and the characters tend to end up with more abilities they can use rather than the raw higher numbers. And I guess the other thing is because everything is skill based or dice based, it doesn't matter if your characters have a D12 plus 4 in a skill. That usually means they're going to do quite well, but fumbles come up. Those ones come up. So it's I don't find that the characters feel as overpowered and I'm not as worried about them advancing out of the content, as it were, as I am sometimes in Savage Pathfinder, or in Pathfinder at default. So the class edges will also give you, when you take them, they will give you different abilities, and each of the different class edges are sort of a core. It's a core reflection of what the relevant Pathfinder class would be. So, as an example, if you are a ranger, let's say, what a ranger gets is they have armor restriction, so they're restricted to medium. Anything heavier than medium, they're going to take penalties. They have a favored enemy, which allows you 1 free reroll with skills that are against them. And when we get to talking about the different subsystems, you'll see how the ranger has a lot more opportunity to shine when you're using those different subsystems, as opposed to just rerolling on attack. They also get a favored terrain. They get rerolls in that. And if you are using the travel mechanic, that can be a big deal there. They get Wilderness Stride, so they can ignore difficult ground, just like in Pathfinder. And that's sort of what they get at a default. Then what you can do is spend edges as your character advances, or if you get access to more edges, and we'll talk about the last component of character generation in a moment, that can give you the opportunity to get more edges. You then can spend them and further customize your character and get your character to be more like the other class, or more like what a ranger is like as they just advance in Pathfinder. So you can get Quarry, so you're getting an even better bonus against the targets. You can get the mystical powers, so the spell casting that rangers get at higher levels in Pathfinder, that is simulated by your character getting access to certain mystical powers. And on top of that, you can also select other edges. So there's certain edges like Beast Friend, which allows you to have a pet. That is not restricted to the ranger. If you want to play a character who is a thief, who has a pet bat or a pet whatever, or a pet tiger, you could do that. You know, you're certainly, it means you're spending one of your resources for creating your character to select that. So you may not be getting something else, but it gives you an option. In addition, you can select a second class feat or class edge at each tier. So if you want to start off playing a character who is a wizard thief, or a character who is a paladin sorcerer, you know, or whatever other combo you want to dream up, you can probably do that. The final thing that you will get, but to reiterate, you get one class feat for free. If you don't take that, you could take a profession feat, or profession edge. But sorry, I keep confusing the nomenclature of the two. But what you can do is take a second edge on top of the free class edge that you get. And the way that feels at the table is that each character, especially with the armor restrictions, it really helps the fighters who are able to throw on heavier armor. It really makes them have their kind of thematic space, like the space that the fighter occupies in Pathfinder First Edition. Heavy armored, same thing with the paladin, that carries over into this edition. The last thing you get to select for your character are what's called hindrances. And hindrances are basically, it is negative things about your character. Drawbacks, as it were. Things that cause your character problems. Those can be inbuilt things, like your character might be bloodthirsty or greedy or heroic. Or it may be something related to their backstory. So they may have enemies, or they may be wanted, or something like that. When you create a character, you can take a major and up to two major, or one major and two minor hindrances. For a major hindrance that you select, you get 2 extra points to spend during character creation. 2 points can be spent to raise an attribute by 1, or 2 points can be spent to get a new edge. 1 point can be spent to get a new point in skills. So, and each minor hindrance gives you 1 point. So your character can ideally start with 4 extra points that could be spent on a 2-for-1 basis to get a raise in your attribute, or to get a new edge, or you could put all 4 points and raise 4 skills. The skills cost the same as they do with your other skill points. Up to the governing attribute costs 1, over the governing attribute costs 2, to a maximum of 10. The last thing that you may need to consider is, apart from gear and things like that, is the arcane background. So the way that Savage Pathfinder models things like spells and other powers like monks' key abilities, or the rangers, the paladins, like lay on hands and other kind of holy powers, is through their power system. The power system is basically a number of different cool powers that your characters can use. Like they have a very specified outcome. Examples of these, I'm talking about them so vaguely it's probably completely unhelpful. Let me give you some examples here. So examples that are very basic and very Pathfinder oriented would be things like Bolt. Bolt is a power that at a range, zip, you do some damage, and that's it. You make an attack roll using your spellcasting ability or your faith ability. If it hits, boom, does damage to someone. You draw the number of times you can do that is governed by your power points. Your power points are drained by making use of your powers. For every hour that you rest doing nothing else, you recover 5 power points, unless you got an edge that speeds that up. Or you can spend a Benny and immediately recover 5 power points. Spells usually cost between 1 and 3 to start with. And then what you can do as well is spend extra power points to change them on the fly. So another one on a more defensive bent might be Protection. So Protection is one where you cast it and then the target gains extra armor. Most spells, if not all spells, have an added benefit when you get a raise on the spell casting. So Bolt does more damage when you get a raise on it. You can also spend more power points to get it in. Same thing with Protection, more power. A neat thing with the Savage Pathfinder rules as well that carries over from the Savage Worlds rules is you can spend extra power points to modify your stuff. When you first make a character and you get a character who has powers, you're going to select what the specific expression of that is in the form of what are called trappings. So to capture the feel and the distinctiveness between, say, a character who does a firebolt and a character who shoots a lightning bolt or melts acid arrow or something like that, the way you do that is you describe what your trappings are. You're pretty free to describe what you want, but once you've selected that, that's how that power works, unless you spend extra power points to change that. The reason it's important is because for one thing, it's an important way to make the different things feel different, the different powers. One person's bolt feels different from another person's bolt. And in particular, in Pathfinder and in Savage Pathfinder, if you're targeting something that is resistant to something, you're going to take a -4 to your effects. Or if it's vulnerable to it, you'll take +4. So say, if you describe your bolt as an ice bolt or a Stylix snowball, or I don't know, however you want to describe that bolt. It does snow or ice damage. Well, against a white dragon, it's going to do 4 less. So it's going to be harder to actually hurt that thing. On the other hand, if the white dragon is vulnerable to fire, because in different versions of D&D they change that up and down, you'll get +4 to damage. This is particularly helpful when, say, you're fighting trolls or things that are particularly vulnerable to specific kinds of damage. In addition, the way you choose to describe some of your other powers too, it could have other effects based on kind of common sense and agreement between the players and the DM. So or Game Master, for instance, I don't know, if the way you described your protection spell was like a supernatural force field that that was completely sealed you in, maybe the DM might also let that protect your vision, say from blowing sand or something like that. Whereas if you described it as like a enchanted piece of metal armor or whatnot, that may not result in that same benefit. However, conversely, that may have another, added benefit. There are about 40 powers in the game, and they are organized by tier as well. So, you're not throwing fireballs at first level. Each of the different classes has a specific list of powers they can select. So you're not going to, things won't feel inappropriate. Like a monk can't throw a fireball, for instance. But otherwise, it's really kind of left to the players and the game master to sort of figure out how these powers are going to look and manifest at the table. That, I mentioned again, that the Savage Pathfinder is not trying to replicate the specific mechanics of Pathfinder. What they're trying to replicate is the feel of that at the table. And one of the ways they do that is, for instance, when wizards gain a new, are able to select new powers. One of the ways you can spend your edges is by getting new powers. Add to your list of things you start with. I think wizards start with 2, sorcerers start with 3. I think bards start with 3 as well. But the neat thing with wizards is if you've recovered, spell books or scrolls or whatnot, when you get a new power, when you get an edge for new powers, you normally get to pick 2 powers and add them to your list. If a wizard has something that is on one of those spell books that they don't know yet, they can add 2 powers plus one of those extra ones for free. So there's a cool kind of way of capturing the idea that the wizard has access to more things. The number of power points they have access to is what governs the how many times a day you can cast stuff. But and the tier governs how powerful those spells really are. World-shaking spells are limited to like legendary. Wish is in this game, but it means that your characters will feel. That's one of the ways they mechanically make your characters feel different. In addition, every character who has got an arcane background, which is basically anyone who can cast spells or use abilities, like rangers' spells or the paladins, magical abilities, or the monks, key abilities. They also have the ability to at will detect arcana, so detect magic to a certain range, and they also have an ability to use what are called cantrips. Cantrips are sort of it is left to the player to sort of improvise and describe how they're going to use cantrips, which are sort of intended to be like minor versions of the powers that they've got. They don't cost any power points unless you roll a failure. I think it's a critical failure that costs you 1. But what that allows you to do is to feel more magical in some of these subsystems that we're going to talk about in a moment, or if you want to use other things. Maybe now is a good point to talk about one other option in combat that I like enormously about Savage Worlds that they've carried over into this. So on your turn, one of the other things you can do to interact with other targets, apart from using powers or just flat up attacking them, is something called a test. And what a test is basically you trying to create an opportunity for other players, or perhaps for yourself as well, if you happen to go before this the target. What you do to do the test is you figure out what narratively you're doing. So it'd be like, I'm going to feint with my blade, or I'm going to kick, dirt or toss dirt in their eyes, or I'm going to suddenly bellow out a mighty half-orc roar and charge in, or I'm going to use cantrip to create some sparkles near them or whatnot. Not anything that's going to blind them or do damage, just something that's going to affect. You then roll against a target that the GM selects. Usually it's going to be spirit or something else. You roll against the target. If you are successful, then what the target, you choose one of two things. The target becomes vulnerable, which means all other actions against it get +2, or they become distracted. And if they're distracted, they take -2 to all of their actions. So the reason that that's, I think, very, very cool is because it is completely unrelated. You can use feint, you might use your fighting, but if your character has no useful fighting skills or anything like that, you can still improvise a cantrip or just use some other neat ability that you've got. Bards, for instance, will make ample use of tests because they can use their They can use their performance to constantly kind of be a pain in the ass and cause problems for their allies. Normally, back round to round to round, you have to use a different skill every time you want to use a test on the same target. They learn your tricks. But with a bard, as long as you sort of change up the narrative description of what they're chanting or saying or singing or whatever, you get to keep doing that. And it may not seem like an awful lot, but remember the +2 may not seem like a lot, but your target number is only a 4 usually. Or if you're fighting an enemy, their parry is on average going to be between like 5 and 7. +2 is a big deal. And there's other things like the rogue's sneak attack that requires someone to be vulnerable. So it facilitates some terrific opportunities for support characters to do cool things in it that are essentially invented by the player. You're coming up with a cool way of doing that. You may toss a stone at a troll's head, knowing it's not going to hurt it, but you're going to try and distract it. And the tests play in with the cantrips. So if you have just because you've got a list of powers on your character sheet, whether you're a wizard or a druid or a cleric or a sorcerer, that's not the only things you can do. Not only can you change up your spells by what you're spending power points on, you're also going to have an opportunity to do things to just in a minor improvised kind of way that will help out your allies. Now, all of this is to say, if you're seeing it again, it is not the same game. It's not trying to replicate the mechanics of Pathfinder. In regular viewers of the channel know we run a lot of AD&D second on the channel, and you can't improvise stuff. Your spells tell you what they do. You don't get to do stuff like this. But what this replicates is the stuff you see in the D&D and the Pathfinder fiction. This is the stuff that is the cinematic and the exciting fictional representation of those adventures. And it feels like that, as opposed to how the specific mechanics of Pathfinder or D&D play out at the table. So that is the way that you should be thinking of the Savage Pathfinder. As an aside, this is intended as an introduction to this and an overview. That's not to say it's going to be for everyone. If I wouldn't use Savage Pathfinder to run every single game I want, because I also like AD&D Second Edition. But for the specific type of experience that it goes for, this is extremely exciting, and it's a ton of fun at the table. Your characters feel like competent badasses without feeling overpowered. And it plays very, very quickly as well, too. So that is the introduction. Let's just go through the rule book here quickly and talk about what's in the actual book. I've covered many of these things like hindrances and the character creation stuff. Maybe to give you an example of what the races would get, let's take a look at dwarves. So dwarves, there we go. Sorry, I printed mine in black and white to keep down costs, but I wanted to have the pretty color cover to show all you fine folks. So the dwarves start with dark vision, so they can ignore illumination for 20 yards. They have iron constitutions. They get +1 to poison, to resist poison, and +1 to resist magic. They get, they're slow, so their pace is reduced by 1. Their running is reduced from a D6 to a D4. They have stone cunning. They can, they get a notice check at +2 as a free action when they're within 10 feet of unusual stonework, like traps or hidden doors. And success means that they know something is off, and a raise gives them more specific information, such as how to trigger the trap or how to open the door. And the final one is they are tough. Dwarves start with a vigor of D6 instead of D4 before you spend your 5 points. They have a maximum vigor of D12 +1. Also, their strength is considered 1 die type higher for armor and worn gear. Not weapons, but for everything else. So that's their way of replicating the sort of dwarves don't slow down thing from Pathfinder. So that's just that example. Just like Pathfinder, the Savage Pathfinder has dwarves, elves, gnomes, half-elves, half-orcs, halflings, and humans. You can also, for those who are in the kludgy kind of homebrew vein, like say I am, you can also make use of, there are rules for costing out new races in Savage Worlds Adventure edition, so you can actually back out the costs of the character, the races that are in here, and then build your own races. I did that with ratlings and androids for our Iron Gods game. That's how I did that. Then we got a list of skills, which gives you a little blurb about what each skill does. And one of the things that is really, really nice about Savage Pathfinder, descriptions of things are rarely more than about 3 paragraphs at the most. So you learn, even if you don't remember what something is, you can go in, take a look, and then you got that. You got a description of what it does. The art that is in Savage Pathfinder is drawn all from not only the core rulebook, but from basically the Paizo art library, it seems. Every one of the class edges also comes with familiar faces for those who are longtime Pathfinder fans. Every one of the iconics is given a novice character. So you have an opportunity to see what those characters are like. And the box set also comes with a number of archetype cards. These present each one of the iconics in a novice state with all their gear and all their selection and whatnot, and in a seasoned state or tier. So if you want to, let me hold these up so you can see what they look like here. So if you wanted to say, just pick up and play and get a game going, you can easily do that, and these are easily modified. I've printed mine out on 2 pages here, but when these come out in the actual box sets, they're going to be about this size, because we've got similar ones in Deadlands and some of the other ones. So for getting people into the game, you hand them a double-sided card and you're off to the races, and they will often have recommendations for the next level, tier or next advancement that you want to pick. They also give suggestions in here too, just like in D&D. There are 20 advancements that they suggest. And they tell you how to get through them. So recommendations. If you really don't want to spend time suffering over these things, and you just want to play a character and get advancements as you go, and make selections only when you have to, like for your powers or whatnot, it's right there for you for every single one of the class edges. Then there is a list of all the different other edges, and prestige classes are prestige edges. Each of them has 3 different sort of chain, or is a 3 edge deep chain. But all the signature ones from the core rulebook, Arcane Archer, Arcane Trickster, Eldritch Knight, Duelist, Dragon Disciple, Assassin, Pathfinder Chronicler, Mystic Theurge, and Shadow Dancer are all in there, and they work just like other multi-classing. You can take one Prestige Edge or one class Edge per tier, including your first one. So if you do want to start off, I don't think you can take Prestige Edges until you reach Seasoned. So just like Prestige classes in Pathfinder, you got to wait till you kind of dip into that stuff. The edges are one of the more interesting things about the game. It's the raising skills and adding new skills and raising your attributes. That's just default. That's no-brainer stuff. Like having more strength is better if you're a melee fighter. But the edges is where you really get into that theory crafting that I think appeals to first edition Pathfinder fans, and that certainly carries over to here. We're on to the gear section next, and one of the things that I find it was a really, really great design decision with this is that the cost of everything in the Savage Pathfinder game, including your magic items, is identical to the cost and the weight in Pathfinder First Edition. And the reason I think that is so helpful is because if you are somebody who is coming to this as a Pathfinder fan and you've got a library of Pathfinder First Edition stuff that you like, and you want to make use of, you can pretty much do that. You may need to come up with the rules or the stats for certain things like exotic weapons, but one of the things I have been using in my campaigns that I've been very happy to is... Actually, I don't know where I put it. It's my Ultimate Equipment Guide. The Ultimate Equipment book from Pathfinder is great because it's got a treasure, like a treasure, monster treasure creation kind of section. And I've been using that in our Savage Pathfinder games. And because the numbers are the same, I can rely on the same, whatever gold pieces I roll in that one translates exactly over into this. Masterwork Weapons is a thing in this as well too. I think that the Masterwork armor needs a little bit of work or a house rule, but the Masterwork Weapons basically give you 1 point of armor piercing with them. So it means that you're able to, if something's wearing armor or has armor as a tough hide, you can get through that. The game also has vehicles, just like in the core rulebook, and then it gets into the rules. Now, the combat rules. The combat rules in Savage Pathfinder are I think a little bit less complex than Pathfinder. There's less just numbers you're going to add to different things. A lot of stuff is more is sort of consolidated or streamlined. Like grappling is significantly easier in or less complicated in this than it is in Pathfinder. But it also has a lot of other things that would be captured by feats in Pathfinder that are instead just regular options. Those are things like Wild Strike. You can take a +2 to hit, +2 to damage, but you are then vulnerable, which means targets get +2 to hit you, and if a thief gets a hit on you, they get to apply their sneak attack damage. Or you can do a Desperate Strike. It gives you a +1 up to a +4 to hit, but you take -1 up to -4, and a commensurate identical amount to damage. That's new to Savage Worlds. That wasn't in other versions of Adventure Edition. Other neat things you can do is if you are out of power points and you're out of bennies, but you really need to get a spell off, you can just take a penalty to your roll equal to the cost. I think that's really interesting because there is a consequence for failure in the game. So that is pretty cool. In addition to your wounds, there is another kind of condition that you track called fatigue. Fatigue is from 1 to 3, and for every point of fatigue you take -1 to all your rolls. Fatigue often comes up in spellcasting, in overland travel, and in other of the subsystems. Some attacks also cause fatigue, but it can cause, depending on the nature of the fatigue you get, it can cause long-term problems for your character, but it does a great job of modeling kind of like a non-wound related injury. Each wound also gives you a penalty. So if you have up to 3 wounds, you could have -3 to all your actions. But if you take 4 wounds and you're a wild card, you start figuring out what you're going to play next, because your character is likely going to die. Doesn't mean you're dead automatically. You're incapacitated, but you're probably going to suffer some kind of persisting long-term wound. I'm not going to go too much further into the combat, because it's combat like in a lot of other RPGs. It's fun. I've talked about how the ways it differs with initiative. There's also something called creative combat that you can use. If you make use of those tests and you get a raise on them. I mentioned that if you get a success, that you get to impose vulnerability or distracted on them. If you get a raise, if you beat them by 4, you can make them shaken. And the reason that's important is because a shaken target, absent any other modifiers, a shaken target who is then hit again and damaged takes a wound, and then another wound for each one. So it's a good setup. If you don't do that, you can roll on this cool, decide you don't want to shake them, you can roll on creative combat here. And what this does is things like they could suffer some kind of setback, like they might fall off a ledge. They may get insight. So once during the encounter, some other the attacker may add 1d6 to any trait roll. So it's a cool kind of, if you want to add a little bit more variety to your damage or to your combat, you can do that. So that covers character creation and combat. There's a lot more to combat than I'm going through, and there's an enormous amount of options for edges that are in here as well. Everything, if you're familiar with Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, there are some changes that have been made for Savage Pathfinder, but you can find those changes listed right at the beginning of the book. They list like, hey, here's what's new, and here's what's changed. Now we're going to get into some of the subsystems. So the subsystems are ways that the game allows you to add a game component to many of the other parts of the game. And one of the ways where this differs from, say like downtime rules in other versions of D&D or Pathfinder, or downtime rules in, I don't know, that covers the things that this is trying to capture. This carries over many of the same exciting elements that come from combat. The use of cards, the use of exploding dice or aced dice, and enormous amounts of creativity on the part of the player. Those are all carried over and provided lenses through which you can do that. And the nice thing with these subsystems is you can choose what to use and how to use it. If you don't like the way the chase rules work, you don't have to do them that way. You can just have them be a quick, one person roll a dice, another person roll a dice, that'll tell them whether they get away. That's what's called a quick encounter in the game. Quick encounter is like, you know what, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. Let's just figure out if you get away and get into the next scene. Or if you do want to spend more time and have more texture to the specific scene, you can do that with downtime rules, with chase rules, with travel rules, with what are they called? Not monologue. Well, we'll go through them and I'll remember as I go. So the downtime rules are not like it's not like the, say, Ultimate campaign where you're keeping track of stuff and whatnot. What downtime is supposed to be like an abstraction of how you spent, like a week of time, a little bit of time between adventures, or a substantial amount of time you spent in town recovering. The actions you can take during that time in downtime include carouse, spend some money, get some information, center, you relax, and you gain a point of what's called conviction. Conviction is the other narrative metacurrency that's in Savage Pathfinder. It differs from Benny's because you only have 1 point, and when you spend it, you get to roll 1d6 and add that to the result of a dice that you already rolled, and it can explode too. It aces. So it's a way of just inching up. If you rolled very close to what you need, but you don't want to risk rolling again, you can spend that conviction, and conviction is rewarded either for centering and downtime or from completing a significant portion of an adventure. It's a reward that is different from just giving an advancement. You can earn money. That depends, how much you earn depends on your tier. You can enchant something. If you got the Artificer Edge, you can make magic items, just like in Pathfinder. You can train, and this is a neat one because what you do is let's see here, you pick a skill that you've got, and then during the next adventure, you can re-roll the dice once. So you kind of pocket a Benny almost that is specifically related to that skill. You choose when to activate that, and Yeah, so it's a neat little way of, if say you want to have an extra Benny for combat, it's your character at the dojo practicing and wielding. Research is another really cool one. It is those of you who have arcane, or characters that have arcane backgrounds where they can cast powers, they select another power that they don't have from the list of available powers, so things that are restricted to your class and restricted to your tier. Pick one of the ones you don't have, and then for one encounter, you can make free use of that ability as if you had it on your list, but you take -2 to all your spellcasting rolls. And that's, I think, really interesting. Like it's sort of similar to like the ritual mechanics you have in 5e, kind of, but it's just a neat way of the players kind of mentally preparing for what's to come and keeping something else in their back pocket. It also sort of replicates the feel of the Vancian magic, and I don't mean that it means that you got to. What I mean by that, I'm not going to say what I don't mean. What I mean by that is that the Vancian magic, the fire and forget magic that you have in Pathfinder, where part of the fun is trying to predict what the problems are that you're going to deal with, and then preparing the spells you need that are necessary. This kind of captures that, where like, I don't think the spell locate is kind of a garbage spell, and why would I take that instead of a combat spell? But maybe that's going to be useful on this adventure, so I'm going to spend my downtime researching that thing instead of getting one of the other options like earning money or getting conviction or whatever. The last one is rest, which is just to gain some, what do you call it back? To heal, to heal long-term wounds that if you became incapacitated, this will heal you for that. I'm spending a lot of time on downtime, but the reason is because I think it makes a fun resource management decision for players over what they're spending their time when they're not just hitting people, right? Back in town time can sometimes be boring, unless your adventure is in town. If you're playing a campaign like, say, Barrow Maze, like our Barrow Maze is a campaign that is a mega dungeon where characters set out from this town called Helix and go out and get into all sorts of trouble. Then they come back, but rarely does anything ever happen in town. That's not where the exciting stuff happens. What downtime does is, it doesn't mean that exciting stuff necessarily. It's not transposing an adventure into the town. It's giving you something cool to make a decision for about your character while you're in town doing downtime. So another thing I've got is dramatic tasks. If you are familiar with the extended tasks from Pathfinder 2 or the Pathfinder 1, I want to try and find a way to say skill challenges, but it's basically skill challenges from 4th edition. Pathfinder incorporated those using in their... Ultimate Wilderness makes use of these, where you need to make X amount of successes before Y amounts of failures. Same thing with Ultimate Intrigue makes use of that. So while Pathfinder Core does not have that, this is a mechanic that is familiar, I think, to people who know the full line or full history of Pathfinder 1st edition or know D&D 4th. What dramatic tasks, one of the ways where they differ from just bog standard challenges is that when you are going through dramatic tasks, and these are extended tests that may have an uncertain outcome. So this is like tracking down the mastermind, or disarming a bomb, or rescuing people from a village set, or a tavern set on fire by a dragon. The way it works is you set a number of successes that need to be achieved or a number of tokens that need to be achieved by the players. On a success, players achieve 1. On a failure, they achieve none. On a fumble, they lose 1. And on a raise, they get 2. It's usually, depending on how complex you want the task to be, it's usually between like 4 successes and 8 successes per player. And then what happens is each turn, what you will do is, just like in combat, you're going to deal out cards. And the cards generally don't have any effect. It tells you the order that people will be describing what they're doing, and the GM may require people to change up the skills they're using. But one of the interesting things with it is, if you get a club means there's a complication that's come up. And what that might mean, depending on the nature of the dramatic task, it might mean that you're just going to take a penalty and you'll describe what that problem is. but it also might mean that it's a separate thing. So you got to deal with this complication, and then you can try and use your skill. So it adds an element of uncertainty to it that is really, really fun. The other thing that I think is interesting about it is that there is a mechanic of aiding another in the game called support. And basically what support is, it's a combat option. You make a target, make a roll with whatever you're doing to support the person. You might be shooting for covering fire. You might be, using your melee attack to try and distract them. It's not like a test where you're going to impose something on the enemy. All it means is if you get a success, you roll 4 or higher. The person who is making the attack or the test, they get +1 to it. And then if you get a raise on your support, you get a +2 to it. The reason I mention that now is because that's the other thing you can do during the thing. If you've got a bunch of characters who only, say like, because of the nature of the dramatic task you're doing, there's only a couple of skills that make sense, but you've got 6 players. You're not going to have everyone roll the exact same thing. What you'll do is pick, all right, who's going to be the lead person here? You're going to make the rolls, and then the other people will support them. And the fun thing with that is that while you're doing that and you're getting the players to justify the use of certain skills, they're investing in that scene and they're really helping to describe the montage or whatever. And I find that it gets the players thinking about the events that are happening and trying to interpret the dice rolls and interpret in particular when complications come up, to interpret what that means in an exciting and fun kind of way. And that builds throughout the different players. So I like it even better. Regular fans of the channel know that I'm a big fan of skill challenges. I think this is an even better version of that. And fumbles can also result in really fun, things. I have used dramatic tasks for things like trying to locate a thing in the wild. And then when I draw a complication, I usually make a potential combat encounter. I have them try to roll to see if they're going to avoid it. And if they're successful, I don't bother with a combat encounter. But yeah, it's a really flexible way of modeling a variety of different things. And because dramatic tasks rely on skills, it means that characters are able to engage with the story in more substantial ways than just hitting stuff or shooting stuff or casting damaging magic at stuff. Your rangers really get to shine in those if survival comes in. They're tracking somebody, say. Priests, maybe gets in, or bards in particular. If they're trying to, raise their reputation in town, right? Maybe that's how you could do a dramatic task that way. So it's another neat sub mechanic that the GM can rely on to make an interesting part of their game. We have rules for fear and for hazards. Hazards are things like cold, drowning, exposure to arduous tasks. This is a nice, very simple way. Traps and haunts are covered by this. It's a way to sort of abstract into the Pathfinder or Savage Pathfinder version to abstract what those kind of mechanics are. Usually the penalties are fatigue. So like if you're traveling in the cold and you don't have appropriate weather or appropriate gear on, you need to make a check, and then if you fail, you will take a point of fatigue. And I mentioned before that fatigue comes in different kinds. Most fatigue, you rest for an hour, it goes away, but travel fatigue in particular lasts until you get a 24-hour rest. So if you want to add tension to overland travel in bad conditions or scorching heat or freezing cold or arduous jungles and swamps, what this does is it gives you a way to give a little feel of that death spiral, right? Because your fatigue gives a penalty to to whatever the characters are going to do, and because it allows the characters to improvise stuff. Do they take a rest and try and fabricate some kind of structure so they can rest and get that fatigue back and then plow on through the journey? Or do they just try to, roll lucky and carry on? Magical abilities can sometimes come into play for that as well. So just another fun way to give characters interesting decisions to make at the table that are framed in a mechanical way that has consequence on the game. So I like that. Interludes is the one I was trying to think of. It's basically a backstory thing. You draw cards, And it's a way of, if you want to fill in some backstory or have the characters have an opportunity to tell a tale around a campfire or whatever. And examples of that would include, like in downtime, I would draw a card. Let me draw a random card here. I drew diamonds. The suit of the card is important, not what the actual card is. Diamonds in downtime. The question is, the character studies or works on an object of some sort in the downtime. What is it? So it's, again, for people who like improvising and like sort of adding moments for their characters to add in story context or story texture to their characters, this is what it gives you the opportunity. I don't make use of that an awful lot, but it's nice having it there, and I have used it a couple of times and I enjoy it. That's, I think, a little goes a long way for the folks that I play with, but if you are in a group that enjoys more of that stuff, then there's your framework for providing that, and to give it a little bit of unexpected, oh, I didn't think of that, stuff. That is so fun with, that's why we roll dice in role-playing games, right? To have the unexpected result. There's rules for mass battles in here. There's rules for networking. And networking is your kind of getting information stuff. Networking is a very broad way of covering it that can usually be covered by either your persuasion, nice approach, or intimidation, the not-so-nice approach, of trying to gain information. And the fun thing that I like about this is that you can have characters help, right? So you can have them support characters. Maybe one character's got great common knowledge. So if a character is trying to track down the name of, like, say one character's spell book got stolen, and they're like, God damn it, I want to find the person who stole this spell book. Well, maybe we'll enter into a, assuming they're not going to be chasing them through a dramatic task, maybe let's frame that as networking. Have them ask around, see if they can't find out. And rather than having only the person who is the chatty character with a good intimidation or a good persuasion as the only person rolling, this is where you can allow other characters to support that. Maybe the guy who has a really good knowledge, the good support role, maybe he knows, who has a high common knowledge. They may, I've heard that this is where these thieves kind of hang out. They make a roll, and then depending on the results of that roll, that might add nothing. It might add a +1, it might add a +2. The thievery character, maybe they can use that to ask around. Maybe the, the wizard could use occult to support. Who would be on the lookout for a spellbook? Why would they want that? Where would they sell it? And you could make that roll. And then once everyone's finished their supporting stuff, then we make the roll for the actual networking. And then based on every success and every raise, you get bits of information. Then you drop back into the fiction and you describe, based on what everyone kind of said, what's happened. And the way of thinking, the way we at least think of this stuff is in terms of sort of how it would look in a movie or a TV show, right? Like how it would be interesting to see this stuff play out. We use the dice rolls to sort of inform the results and the consequences, and then we describe what's happened, both good and bad. If it's a good result, that's fine. If it's a bad result, the players are often will jump in and help you figure out, as the marshal or the GM, what's going on. I mentioned quick encounters. Those are the things that, if you just want to abstract something down to one dice roll that isn't combat or isn't something else that's governed by another area, you can just do this. So examples are like crisis, missions, treks, combat. If you don't want to engage one of the more complicated subsystems, quick encounters is where you want to go to just take care of that. Then there is the travel rules. There's social conflict rules as well too, but I don't tend to make use of those. They are in here, so if you do want to have something that it's not just talking combat the way that some social conflict rules can work in some role-playing games. There is more to it in this than there is in those games, but I haven't made use of them yet, so I can't really speak to them, but they are in here as well, and they are different from... It's actually very similar to dramatic tasks, but that end, in the sense that you have a limited number of times you can make certain skill rolls, people can support, people can be primary actors, and then at the result of that, you will get a number of tokens based on your how well you did in those rounds, and then you look at how many tokens you have once the time's up. And that tells you how well you did or how well you didn't do. It's good, and I don't mean to make it sound like that it's not a solid system. It's just that I haven't used it yet, so I really can't speak to how it plays at the table. The final one I'll talk about here is travel. Travel is something I really love a lot because it It's a way of doing overland travel in a more... I find it's more nuanced than what default, say, Pathfinder or D&D or whatever, any of the classic fantasy role-playing games have it. In, say, AD&D Second, what you're going to do is you're going to roll percentage, and you're going to see how many, what the chance is of a combat encounter, or rather a chance of an encounter. You may have if you roll that there is an encounter, you roll in your encounter table, find the monster, then you might roll their reaction, like how are they going to respond. Not everything is hostile. But if they're hostile, if it's like undead or trolls or something like that, they're probably going to be hostile. Well, then it's just going to result in combat. AD&D, Pathfinder at default, they don't have, in those random encounters, they have not incorporated the possibility of things like like a friendly stranger or a bizarre, bizarre weather condition or something like that. You can roll weather separately, or a strange geological find, right? What the travel mechanic in Pathfinder does is, or Savage Pathfinder, is every day you travel, you draw a card from the action deck, and you might draw more depending on, how challenging things are. What I do is every hex that the characters enter in our Savage Pathfinder game, they draw a card. And there is another subsystem I'll talk about at the end of the video that interacts with this. But for the base travel rules out of this is all you need to know. Every day of travel, or however often the GM wants, we draw a card. So, boom. Oh, Joker. Let's draw another one to show. Here we go. So, if what I draw is not a face card, it's not a jack, a queen, a king, an ace, or the Joker, nothing's happened. Nothing happens. If I do draw one of those, King of Hearts, what I do is I look and see what the result is. Each of the suits corresponds to a different kind of encounter. Spades are enemies, hearts are strangers, diamonds are treasure, and clubs are an obstacle. Now, if you draw what I drew, the Joker, to start with, you draw two and combine the suits into some other kind of encounter. So, clubs and diamonds. Clubs and diamonds gives me an obstacle with treasure. So maybe there is, bad weather comes in, there's flash flooding, but in the center of this river, there appears to be a slowly eroding encampment that has, loot and whatnot in it. Something to incentivize the players going in to try and get the thing. Or maybe there's an earthquake coming in, or the tide is coming in, and they come across a entrance to a ruin that may very quickly be obscured or covered over. Whatever it is you want. In a lot of the settings, and I anticipate in Savage Pathfinder as well, they're going to give you encounter lists for each of these different things, for what treasure it could be, for whatever. And some of the other Savage Worlds games as well, they're even more interesting. So when you roll one of these things, there's all sorts of different possibilities that are very, very interesting. And the reason I mentioned what the default things are in D&D and in Pathfinder is because you'll note that only one of the results, one of the four possible results of suits, is violence in this, is enemies. One is enemies, treasure, obstacles, or strangers. So I find that to be a really exciting and more nuanced approach to doing random encounters. It's also, if you're using just the travel rules, it's super easy to incorporate into your ongoing play. And if you are the type of DM who doesn't like improvising as much, who wants to have things prepared, you can absolutely prepare what these things will be. If you know your characters are going to be traveling for, say, 3 weeks, that's a total of 21 different cards you're drawing if you're going to draw one every day. The likelihood of drawing a suit is what, like 1 in 5, or 1 in 3, I should say. So if 1/3 of the results are going to result in encounters, to be safe, you could put down a list, just to jot down ideas, or if you really want to build them out, you can put down what specific things would be encountered for each of those 4 categories. But you do 1/3 of them. So if there's 21 days of travel, that's 7 things you need to prep. 7 things times 4 for the different categories. That is 28. If you don't make use of those 28 things in that one session, you keep them for next time. Or you cycle them back through. Certain regions are known to be populated by trolls, so people see a lot of trolls, just like in a normal random encounter table. But I just, and also if you've got a way of that you want to sort of organically introduce elements of your game and make them feel spontaneous, that's a way to do it. If you want to introduce a specific item, a MacGuffin or something like that to the characters that's going to cause problems for them down the road, just wait till they draw treasure. They'll grab it, they'll get it. Just wait. So it's the final of the subsystems that I wanted to talk about that I think are really good for this. Then you got your powers, and there's a full description of powers. And not only does each individual power have certain modifications that can come from spending extra power points on it, it also, every one of them has access to something called power modifiers, which are other ways to modify what your powers actually manifest like. So again, it is definitely not specifically trying to replicate what the mechanics are in D&D, but it definitely feels like them in play. The next section in the book is magic items, everyone's favorite. And magic items it's all signature stuff you would recognize from Pathfinder, and they give you rules for creating them as well, and for adding, for making things like scrolls or staves or whatnot. The way they've gone about it is, I think, quite clever, because basically, if you've got, say, a staff of healing has a certain amount of charges to it, it will cost. Basically, what they do is they categorize the use of unmodified powers in either a minor or a major role. Minor means as if you cast that power with just a success, not a raise. Major means you got a success plus a raise. And then other things are built, like Potion of Greater Healing is built with some of the power modifiers built into it, something that will be able to like cure critical wounds or things like that. If you suffered a crippling injury as a result of being incapacitated, cure serious wounds could bring you back up. I'm trying to think what else here. So then there's there's not really much else to say about if you can think of a magic item that's in the Pathfinder core book, it's here. Not everyone is here necessarily. Like the universal items, like the Stone of Earth elemental summoning, for instance, is not in here. But it's not. All the highlights are here. And then the final thing is the DM section, and the GM section is really more going to be about. It's going to be more useful when we actually have access to the bestiary. At the time of recording, the bestiary is not out yet. Boy, am I looking forward to that. But they give some great rules in here, and there are some rules that are brand new to the Savage Worlds milieu or rule set. The things I'll mention just as standouts in here, one of them is the comment about bennies. When I first started running Savage Worlds in general, I found I was pretty stingy with bennies, which led to the players being pretty stingy with bennies. Bennies are part of the game that are intended to be spent and received. They're supposed to be there to mitigate against some of the more unexpected and unforgiving elements of an exploding dice game. So the recommendation in here is like, award more than you think you should, like keep them flowing. That will encourage players to use them. I also get in the habit of when I see something, I'm like, players may not like that. I ask out loud, you want to spend a Benny on that? And they're like, yeah, why not? And because of the amount of things you can spend bennies on, like, getting a new action card. And it's worth noting that functions in every one of the subsystems as well. So dramatic tasks, travel, all that stuff. Chases, I didn't mention chases. Are chases in here? Maybe they're not in here. That's a thing I'll mention in the end. So chases, I'll bet you chases will show up in the companion, though, because the chase rules in Savage Worlds are enormously fun. The other thing that they mention is, I mentioned that there's two kinds of adversaries. There is wild cards who have 3 wounds. They have their own bennies. They can spend bennies like everyone else. The DM otherwise starts with 1 benny for every player. The Extras are the others. Extras at default go down by 1. There are two ways that this game changes those two types of characters to fit the feel of D&D. One of those is something called, I think it's called Unstoppable. And it is, what this does basically, I may have the name wrong, but what it does is it means that the character can never take more than 1 wound from an attack ever. So this is to reflect like a dragon or like some other titanic beast, a kaiju or whatever. That thing doesn't matter how good the character happens to luck into rolling or whatever, they're never taking more than 1 wound. It also means that the DM can spend a Benny, one of their bennies, to soak and get rid of that. So it allows, that may seem like, oh, what a slog, but what I think it does instead is it allows the boss fight to be a boss fight, right? Like, because you're not going to the boss isn't ever going to get, if they've got Unstoppable, they're never going to get one-shotted. The other interesting thing that I think is there's resilient and very resilient. And what that does is it adds a wound to an extra. So one of the things, this is a bit of, not Pathfinder, but it's a different game. One of the things that always sort of felt a little weird about, I'm a big, on record here as being a big fan of D&D 4th edition. I really had a lot of fun with that. But what always did feel a bit strange was when my players were facing minions, which take 1 hit and then they die. Minions that were like ogres or some other massive creature. It just felt a little weird. I wanted them to feel like stormtroopers so the players could feel like badasses cutting through them, but it did feel a little weird that like an ogre minion had exactly as much toughness as, say, like a goblin minion. Obviously, they didn't have the same stats of AC or things like that, but it just kind of felt weird. What Resilient does is it allows you to make certain monsters a little tougher. So it allows you to have the full range of wounds before a character dies. So you can have regular extras, as soon as they take a wound, they die. Resilient extras can take 1 wound and then they die. Very resilient extras, like I use this for trolls, can take 2. So I had a very resilient troll, and you can combine those things if you want, an unstoppable resilient extra, but I don't know why you would do that. Like just make it a wild card. It'll be, I guess the argument against that is that the wild card is rolling a wild dice, so they're rolling 2 dice with every action, as opposed to the extra who's only ever rolling 1. So what that does at the table is it allows you to have a little more, like if you did combine, or if you did have the 2 wounds for the trolls, they felt a lot tougher. Not just because their toughness was very hard, like very high, and it was pretty high. It was also the fact that, like, gosh, it took a lot to take them down. So the Savage Pathfinder gives you an enormous amount of tools as the GM to tweak the combat encounters to make them feel like you want them to feel. And the other thing, that they have good advice in there for, they say first off, like the challenge rating system from Pathfinder 1, you can't just translate that over into this. Instead, what they say is, figure out what the relative power is. So like the toughness of the target, the highest damage they do, the best skill they have, compare that to your player characters. And then from there, you can say, like, usually it's 1 wild card and 4 extras per character. So you can have a pretty interesting and big fight. With novice characters, you could have let's say a standard group of 4 player characters. You could easily do an encounter with 1 wild card and 16 extras, and those player characters they should be able to get through that no problem. This is assuming like the damage isn't whatever. And the reason that is, I think it's interesting, is because it really allows the characters to feel like the badasses that they appear like in fiction, in the Pathfinder or D&D fiction. It doesn't mean that it is a walk in the park for them, because, an unlucky strike from a goblin or whatever else is still as bad as, as bad as taking an unlucky strike from any other more challenge adversary. But it does allow the players to really take on some pretty substantial adversaries and really have that moment to shine, to be real, great and badass characters. So that's what's in the core rulebook for Savage Pathfinder at present. If all you wanted to join this video for was just to figure out what's in Savage Pathfinder, this is where we're ending that part. Next thing we're going to talk about is Iron Gods for folks who may join us. Actually, maybe let's do this first. Let's talk about the extra rules I'm incorporating into my Iron Gods game. So if you want to still know more Savage Worlds content, you don't have to skip through or sit through the Iron God stuff if you don't care about that. The other stuff the stuff I'm using, I mentioned chases. Chases are one of my favorite elements in Savage Worlds. The way that it works is, and chases are intended to cover foot chases, horseback races, car chases, dog fights, all sorts of stuff. You need 2 decks of cards in order to do this. One deck of cards is going to be set out on the table, and it'll have usually about 9 to start with. And then depending on the nature of the chase, if it's on foot, if it's in the sky, if it's in space, if it's underwater, that'll determine how much space is between each of them. The face or the suit of the thing becomes important when the player characters have, or actually any of the characters, draw a club on their turn. Just like in dramatic tasks or in combat during a chase, each character is provided a card from a different deck, and if their card happens to have a club on it, it means they face a complication. And the suit of the card that they are currently on, the space that they're in, that will tell them the nature of the failure. So if they fail, it'll tell them what happens. That's just the bare bones mechanics of it, and then they leave it up to you to sort of describe, you and the players, describe what's going on. I've used this system to run a chase, as characters were trying to escape from a giant worm in a mine, where the characters are trying to catch up to someone and bring them down. And for most recently, it was escaping a ruin. Someone had accidentally summoned a bunch of undead spirits, and they were trying to get out of there. Then what the characters do is each round they can either, depending on the nature of the chase, if it's on foot, it's athletics. If it's in space, it's piloting. If it's on the ground and you're on ground cards, it's driving. If it's on horseback, it's riding. Then modifiers can be added to your roll if you're faster or slower or whatever. Each character then makes one of those rolls for free, and then they get to take an action on top of that. It's turning around and shooting at somebody. It's I don't know, it's using a spell to create a barrier for somebody, whatever they choose to do with their action. If they choose not to take an action and focus exclusively on just getting away, they get a +2 to that action. So if you've seen on any of our videos where there's a list of different cards, and the tokens are slowly moving their way along like that, that's what that is. And the neat thing is because the players they get to know what each of the suits are, what the consequences are for getting a club in those, they get pretty leery on some of them. Jokers in particular can be really, really dangerous and throw you really far behind. So it's a neat way of adding adding dramatic tension on a round per round basis to something that's basically just like picking a skill and rolling it and taking actions and adding in narrative flourish. So I'm hoping that they do add chases into the Savage Pathfinder companion. The other mechanic I'm using is on a regular basis is something from Savage Rifts. Was a Kickstarter from about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a conversion of the classic Palladium RPG, the post-apocalyptic RPG Rifts into Savage Worlds. The Tomorrow Legion Field Manual is one of the books that came out in the second Kickstarter, and in it has a set of rules for something called journeys. And journeys are something that work in concert with the travel rules that are in Savage Pathfinder or Savage Worlds, Savage Worlds Adventure Edition. On journeys, what the characters pick is they pick people to play specific roles at the start of each day. One person is a navigator. They're going to be rolling a survival check. One person is a lookout. They're keeping an eye out, and they're rolling a notice check. And then there may be a person who's a pilot or someone who's caring for animals. And that's going to be whatever, riding or, riding or driving or piloting. And then the last one is a scout, and that's a person who uses stealth. Now, what those do is, depending on the results of those rolls, it tells you whether the characters get lost. It might affect the way that you're drawing cards for the for the encounters. So let's say for that day I draw a card and it's going to be a spade in a suit. Like I draw the Jack of Spades. That means there's enemies. If the lookout got a success or got a raise on their roll, then that combat encounter cannot ambush the characters. I don't have to roll for them to spot the enemies. They're for sure not going to be ambushed by them. Then they just have to roll and see if they can sneak up on the enemies. So that's one way where the consequences of that part of that day plays forward. And the scout one I think is even the coolest, because on a success, or rather on a raise, the scout draws 2 cards each day. So let's say I draw Queen of Clubs, which means it would be a obstacle, and I also draw, the second one is Jack of Hearts. Hearts is strangers, potentially friendly strangers. The scout gets to decide which of those 2 play out. If they fumble, though, I, as a DM, get to draw both and see which one I want to use. So there's a cool risk-reward mechanic there as well. The nice thing is, too, is that it gives another opportunity on a daily basis for characters who are trained in skills that often don't see. Notice comes up quite a bit, and stealth to a degree, but like stealth is such a tricky thing to play out in a combat encounter in role-playing games that it's like we recently revisited 3.5, and trying to actually get a stealth off successfully in that game is very challenging and very situational. This allows someone who's got a great stealth to be an ass kicker every single day. Same thing with survival. And the other thing I'm using from this is the supplies. So there's a set of rules that are in here for supplies. Basically, every character every party will have an abstracted amount of supplies, and that covers food, water, ammunition, and then general supplies. And that could be replaced with, like, if you're in a modern setting, with supplies to repair stuff. It's salvage and whatnot to keep things running. What you do is characters have a certain number, a certain dice score in that, and then every day they need to roll that dice plus their wild die, and they need to get a success. If they get a success, they didn't consume too much of their resources. If they get a failure, then that dice of their resource goes down by 1. So if they started at a D6 and they failed, it goes down to a D4. And if they get a fumble, if they rolled 1 on both the supplies dice, or whatever the relevant supplies, food, water, whatever, and the wild dice, you roll 1d4 plus 1 and reduce the dice by that. So this is some cataclysmic, like, oh shit, the water got spoiled, or oh crap, the food got wet, or whatever you want to say as the narrative reason for it. The reason I like that is because it allows those elements to play a role in the game as you're traveling over land, to give them things that they want to work after without making them keep track of how many pounds of food they've got or how many whatever. It's just an interesting, different way. And it also, like other elements of Savage Worlds, can lead to surprise, circumstances. Oh crap, we're out of food now. Oh crap, we're out of water now. Players can refresh stuff with that too. So when you're going through the adventure, when they come across, say, a treasure, what you might say is like, oh, this is a field of fresh berries. So I'll allow you to bump up your food supplies by 1. Or it's a fresh stream that you found. Bump up your water supplies by 2 dice size. Whatever ways. You can be as inventive as you want with that. But it's a neat way because when players get used to playing with that stuff, it's something that they're definitely mindful of, and they become cognizant of the value of that stuff without having to, get into bookkeeping of how many water skins they're carrying or whatever. In a game that really does play up that nitty gritty element, like in our AD&D second edition games, players are regularly carrying a bunch of water skins with them because they don't want to run out of water. And that is kind of cool, but this is a different way of achieving that, I think, the same kind of feel without having to, have the player's intention, like, I'm going to take 6 water skins and then I'll never be out of water kind of stuff. So those are all my the rules that I'm using. I'm also using, stuff from gear from different products, like weapons and high-tech weapons, high-tech armor, high-tech equipment to model the stuff from Iron Gods. But that's sort of everything I'm using for Savage Worlds. So by this point, I know it's an awful lot of information, but I hope that this has at least given you an idea, or if you want to replay and refresh your memory, this gives you an idea of what is in Savage Pathfinder, what the different subsystems are, and the things I'm particularly using at the table. I'm hoping that this will help if you are joining us for any of these Iron Gods games or for the gaming marathon. This will help you understand what you're seeing happen at the table, why we've got a bunch of playing cards set across the table, or what it means, why everyone gets so excited when a Joker gets drawn. That way you can enjoy the mechanical twists and turns as much as what the players are. The last section of this video is just going to be about a very brief overview of what Iron Gods is. It is not going to take very long because I don't want to spoil too much stuff, but Iron Gods, for those who are unfamiliar, was a 2014 adventure path, or at least started in 2014, that Paizo put out for Pathfinder 1st Edition. Like all of their other adventure paths, it covered 6 different modules, ranging from 1st level up to, I believe, 18th. Maybe 20th, I don't remember. In any event, the modules are the Fires of Creation, Lords of Rust, the Choking Tower, Valley of the Brain Collectors, Palace of Fallen Stars, apparently I can't read, and the conclusion is the Divinity Drive. Now, the campaign has an interesting structure to it in the sense that it goes dungeon crawl for the first module, sandbox for the second, dungeon crawl for the third, sandbox for the fourth, sandbox for the fifth, and then a dungeon crawl for the final. And it is set in a land called Numeria, which is, you will recognize from the image on the screen here, Numeria is a land of fallen stars. 9,000 years in the past, there was for the viewers, you're not going to worry about the spoilers here, I don't think, but there was a spaceship or a series of spaceships that broke up and came smashing down onto Golarion, the world where the Pathfinder adventure, or the default Pathfinder world is set. And that has left the land of Numeria with all sorts of bizarre ruins that are full of crazy high-tech stuff. There is strange mutations from creatures exposed to different weird magic and radiation and fluids that permeate the region. There's also alien creatures that were in this massive spaceship that escaped and became part of the the ecology. There's also robots and all sorts of other bizarre high-tech things that are found in the region. And this picks up 9,000 years afterwards, so it's the post-apocalypse kind of. The dominant species that live in this region include humans from these Kelid tribes, which are very much like Conan's Cimmerian. They're anti-magic and they're anti-technology. There's also orcs. There's ratling, which are like rat folk. There's rat folk, which are like ratlings. Or Yasaki from Starfinder, if you're more familiar with that. There's androids, which are these strange human-looking creatures with odd emotional processes, so they don't interact with humans quite in a comfortable kind of way. It's a very Lieutenant Commander Data kind of vibe for the androids. And on top of that, there's the other standard races you would expect, and the adventure path has a distinctive feel of being inspired by Dungeons & Dragons classics like Expedition to the Barrier Peaks or Gamma World. I know Gamma World isn't D&D, but it's an old TSR thing, so I'm counting it. Or more modern inspirations like Thundercats or Thundar the Barbarian or He-Man to a degree. Or Fallout. There's a couple of in-jokes to Fallout that happen in a couple of the modules. And it is just a It is an enormously fun adventure path. It's got a great series of stories, some really interesting and compelling adversaries, some fun set pieces throughout the course of the adventure, and the sandboxes take place in a enormously fun and varied, post-apocalyptic science fantasy setting. There's some terrific villains in it, sullen barbarian kings and bizarre AIs and, evil robots, corrupted techno-sorcerers who want to not only, dominate through force of arms, but also through secret police and other insidious methods, and spies. And your heroes, over the course of the campaign, get to recover a bunch of awesome and cool stuff. So they get not only the usual kind of like magic items and scrolls and rings and whatever else too, you're also finding ray guns and power armor and hover, belts and things like that. And those are obviously, because they're 9,000 years old, they're often require some kind of maintenance and whatnot. So there's an interesting kind of resource management crafting component. It's another rule I stole from Savage Rifts is malfunctions. On a fumble, if you're using a high-tech piece of gear, it's going to malfunction and it requires repair. So it's got a bit of a fun, sandboxy, persisting world problem where, like, even if you've got access to these awesome devices when you find them, there's an incentive to either make allies with people who know how to keep these things running or what, but they're also an enormous they're an enormous treasure or reason for why the bad guys, the Technic League, the evil sorcerer scientists, why they want to track down and grab that stuff from your guys, as well as some other as yet hidden factions. We're obviously not going to play a 6-part adventure path over our weekend. But what we're going to do, what we have been doing and what we are going to do is really try and build up to that first module. And ideally, we'll see if we can get through the first module. If we don't, my heart won't be broken. Because one of the things that is I think the most interesting about Savage Worlds at the table, and this includes Savage Pathfinder too, is because of the unexpected results that come from the interaction of the different subsystems, of the different creative ideas the characters come up with, the weird exploding dice, the consequence of fumbles, and the other things like complications that come up with drawing clubs, it is an enormously surprising and engaging game. There's constantly something interesting happening. And we have found over the course of play that, sessions that we plan to do like X, Y, Z in the session, instead we get caught up in one thing. And that ends up dominating, say, half of the session or the full session in some cases. And because the game is so interesting and engaging, you constantly feel like you've got good decisions to make. There's stakes for what is happening on a round-per-round basis. Even those diversions feel like time well spent and feel like there is a story that is coming together from it. So that is our plan to do that, but we have been having an enormous amount of fun in our time leading up to the road to Iron Gods that we'll have to see. I might, we're seeing some things come together in these early sessions, and I may just explore that rather than getting in. But I am making use of a great deal of material. The combined effect of these modules with the Numeria Land of Fallen Stars book is that it gives you a great series of resources about the different regions. So when players want to go around, we may not get to the conclusion or to the destination that we would if we followed the path of the adventure path, but I am certainly able to make use of a lot of stuff, and you're going to see a lot of material from this show up, just maybe not in quite the way that we had intended it. Apart from that, I think that's everything you need to know about Iron Gods. Just, it is a different setting for sure. It is a science fantasy world, so you're not seeing classic D&D or fantasy races in there. At least they're not the dominant ones. But at its heart, it definitely is that. It is a Pathfinder, Dungeons & Dragons thing of going out, getting into adventures, getting cool loot, and seeing your characters advance and get new abilities and powers and whatnot over the course of their adventures. We're going to see characters go up pretty quickly over the course of the adventures on the weekend too. So, or at least of the adventure, the marathon. So yeah. So anyway, to conclude the video then, I see we've been going for 2 hours now. So that's about average for me. Maybe I'll check my chat, see if there's anyone there who wants to, has any questions about it. But I'm hoping that what this will do is particularly for regular viewers in the channel who aren't familiar with Savage Worlds or maybe leery of Iron Gods because they're not familiar with it, particularly with people who are playing or watching our Forgotten Realms and our Forgotten Realms and our Greyhawk games. This will give you at least your footing for you to understand where we're playing and what rules are at play, what's kind of going on the mechanics side. If it doesn't, or if there's other questions you have, please do not hesitate to have leave a comment in the comment section of the video, and I'll endeavor to reply in a timely fashion. Or you can reach me on Twitter at Dungeon Musings, or you can reach me by email at dungeonmusings@gmail.com, or you can find me on the Dungeon Musings Discord server, and you can find a link to that in the description below. While you're down there too, you can also find a link to the Savage Pathfinder Kickstarter. You still can get in on that up until October of 2021. And if you want to find more about the Iron Gods Adventure Path, I've got a link down there to Paizo's page about this too, which includes a free player's guide too. So if you want to check out just what the backstory is for it even, you can get that for free, and there is absolutely no risk to you in doing so. The last thing I'll say is thank you. Thank you so much for joining me for this this overview of Pathfinder or Savage Pathfinder, and a brief introduction to the Iron Gods. Other than that, if you are, let's see here. Oh, excellent. Thanks. Oh, Wayne, thank you so much. Yeah. That's excellent. So Wayne says that having some insight into the game will help with watching it. Absolutely. And Wayne, you'll be very happy to know, before I shot this video, Anna Banana and I went for a very long walk. So she is currently passed out and panting in the in the other room. So those who aren't familiar with the channel, Anna Banana is my my pup. So and Sean, awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really been great seeing you again too, Sean. And Jeffrey, thank you. Well, of course, I'm a danger to the multiverse. It's been great gaming with you again, Sean, too. I really am happy that you're able to join us for the road to it, and looking forward to what's going to happen over the gaming marathon. Otherwise, folks, I will shut up now and call this a video. Thank you so much for joining me. As is always the case, until we see you again, hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and happy gaming.